one of the world's most brilliant strategic minds. His actions on and off the battlefield have cemented his status as one of history's greats. From his sudden rise through the ranks of one of the world's strongest armies to his tragic defeat at Waterloo, his triumphs and failures are studied to this day. But behind all of his victories and defeats, there was simply a man and his character traits who would go on to change the course of military history. He is, of course, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769. From early on in his life, Napoleon shared a deep connection with his mother that would persist to the end of his life. This connection was complemented with the attitude of his father, who continually pushed him to aim for success. Despite being born into a fairly poor family, he was able to attend private schooling. From there, Napoleon was able to attend École Militaire, a prestigious military school, and became an artillery officer through his rigorous study. After graduating from the prestigious school, Napoleon's unique leadership style and character became a staple of his success. His character traits, which included confidence and his logistical ability, were the main contributing factors. Napoleon's confidence is largely responsible for his initial rise to power and his success on the battlefield. By his confident decisions, Napoleon was able to establish a name for himself early on. This in turn boosted popular support among the French people, which allowed him to seize power. One such instance occurred early in his career, when he was still an artillery captain. When the British began to capitalize on France's weakened state after the French Revolution, they sent an envoy of boats to France's main coastal base on its southern shore. Napoleon, being a senior artillery officer present at the base, was instructed by his superiors to not engage the British ships until their soldiers had disembarked. This order was most likely done in order to make use of France's superior ground forces, but was extremely risky and would have been a major misuse of resources that may have cost the independence of France. Napoleon, realizing this, boldly instructed his men to point their cannons at the ships and engage them. This move repelled the British and may be responsible for preserving French independence. This move was also understandably celebrated among the French people and popularized Napoleon's name. This confidence also influenced his success after his initial rise to power. Smaller examples include: another major contributing factor to Napoleon's success was his logistical capability. This trait is well documented in Napoleon and the way in which he managed supplies for his armies. Before being crowned emperor, Napoleon relied on traditional European tactics to supply his armies, which included raiding towns for supplies. His success on the battlefield allowed him to take better care of his men, but also highlighted the inefficiencies of military logistics at the time. Using this knowledge, Napoleon developed his future strategies around his supplies. For instance, he developed a system in which food and housing would be provided for the troops in occupied towns in exchange for a note that could be redeemed at France's treasury in order to save time. Another example of this new series of strategies included his reluctance to partake in sieges, despite them being used quite often in his time, because of the concern of adequately supplying his entrenched men for long periods of time. Instead, Napoleon would opt for decisive battles with the enemy rather than attrition to ease the logistical burden. Some question Napoleon's logistical ability, pointing to his failure to perceive threats to his supply in his Russian campaign. However, evidence is clear that Napoleon was aware of the risk, but instead was overly confident in his abilities rather than unaware. As his strategy would imply, Napoleon counted on a quick, decisive victory against the Russians in order to decide the fate of the war. Despite his success, Napoleon's character traits would also be the cause of his eventual downfall. There were two aspects in particular of Napoleon's character that contributed to this, them being overconfidence and his over-reliance on military action as opposed to other forms of conflict resolution. Perhaps the most iconic and influential aspect of Napoleon was his confidence. Ironically, his confidence was largely responsible for his rise to power, but paired with his other traits, are mainly responsible for the key tactical errors that led to his downfall. Napoleon's career is littered with examples of extreme confidence, both to his detriment and benefit. A very notable example of this overconfidence leading to disastrous results occurred in his campaign in Russia, as he tried to capture Moscow. As Napoleon began pushing into Russia, the Russians refused to battle him head-on and opted to retreat farther into their own territory. Napoleon, ever sure of his victory, pursued the Russians towards Moscow and was forced to endure the Russian winter. The loss of life experienced by this tactical error would cripple Napoleon's future fighting ability. Another crucial aspect to Napoleon's ultimate defeat was his overdependence on military solutions to problems. This is in part due to the strains he put upon his allies and the tendency for these minor conflicts to develop into wars. In fact, Napoleon's entire campaign into Russia may have been avoided had he responded to Russian diplomacy. This overdependence on military solutions is also responsible for the amount of nations that formed coalitions to stop him. His record of completely abolishing the power structure of conquered regions gave rise to a fear in other nations that he would do the same to theirs. These coalitions had their most significant victory at Waterloo, the battle that cost Napoleon his throne. Despite Napoleon's often brilliant military conquests, he can never fully rely on them alone to manage his new empire. His character truly was one of action rather than diplomacy and negotiation, and so without a way to maintain the effectiveness of his victories, his empire fell apart.